Hello, everybody, and welcome to another E5 podcast. I am one of your hosts today. My name's Paul Meenan, and I am joined by a new co-host. Introduce yourself.
My name's Richard Emery.
Richard Emery, welcome to the E5 podcast series. Hopefully this will be the first of many multiple occasions where we tantalize the listeners with lots of golden gems and nuggets of knowledge and bullets to load in their guns so they can fire back at the insidious, corrupt and just corner-cutting bastards that exist within the industry.
I'll be off then.
Yeah. No, not you. Stay at least till we get to the end of this. So, Richard, you've come on. What are we going to talk about in tonight's podcast?
Well, I think we should have a little delve into competency tonight, Paul.
You've just used the C word in a podcast.
Sorry, mate. It is after the watch. The watch.
Well, yeah, but if the lads are listening to this in the morning and they've got a young apprentice in the van, for those young apprentices listening, by the way, the C word is not the 4-letter variation, which a lot of people take huge umbrage to. In our industry, the other C word we're talking about is competence, which tends to get people's backs up just as much as the 4-letter variation. So, shall we delve into competence? So, you've come on, Richard. What do you want to say about? Where do you want to talk about competence in general for the listening sparks or the engineers and managers? What bugs you? Because I could do 5 hours on this. What do you want to?
Yeah, I think that there seems to be a disparity between what the great and the good sat here think is competent, and what we seem to see daily from the guys on social media posting horrible pictures of nasty things. And I think it's a bit of a top-down look at what it is, how it's defined, your defence, maybe, what sort of prosecutions we've had.
I think it's worthwhile. I agree with that. I think it's worthwhile for the guys listening, the guys and girls, pardon me, listening. If you're thinking this is going to be a boring rant about competence, it may be a rant. It hopefully won't be boring. But we'll start off with a benchmark definition. So a definition of competence. The health and safety executive have defined the word competence, because I think me and you, Richard, can agree competence, depending on where you are, is subjective. But if you look deep enough, there is sufficient information to be able to say, well, actually, it's pretty well defined depending on what industry and what task you're doing. But the health and safety executive, let's start this off right, they have defined competence as, and tell me if I'm wrong, the combination of training, skills, experience, and knowledge that a person has and their ability to apply them to perform a task safely. Would you agree with that?
I would. And to extend on that, we have of course, the electricity at work regulations. No person should be engaged in any work activity where technical knowledge or experience is necessary to prevent danger or where appropriate injury, unless he possesses the knowledge, experience, or is under such degree of supervision as may be appropriate, having regard for the nature of the work.
So the HSE define it, electricity at work regs define it. So there's a term you need to know if you're listening. A lot of managers and safety professionals that may walk around your sites may refer to a document called HSR 25, which is the nice lightning bolt type cover document, which is the guidance on the memorandum on the electricity at work regulations, or HSG 85. Another really good guidance, which gives a lot of informed decision-making tools to managers, supervisors, persons undertaking, preparing and doing electrical work, which is really, really good. So you can Google them. They're free downloads. For me, though, one of the things that resonates with me in competence, I sat with you, Richard. A lot of people don't know this. We might as well tell them. So we sit on the electrical safety round table for workplace safety. So it's quite a passionate thing, and we're very privileged to know Louise Taggart, whose brother sadly passed away from an incident where he was electrocuted fatally. So it's something very close to our hearts. And you have a really great term that you've used, and it resonates with me. And I actually now use your term in training that I use. Would you like to use your 5-letter term?
Okay,
Which
so
takes me back to my teens.
the term is S.K.A.T.E, skills, knowledge, aptitude, training, and education.
So I would suggest that you don't skate your way into prison, and you remember that acronym. So it's skills, knowledge, attitude,
Aptitude,
knowledge, and
yeah,
experience. Skate. I love that.
training
It's
and education.
it's probably my new favorite term to help define competence. But more importantly, if you can remember one thing from this podcast, it's skate. But don't forget one thing, it's the application of all of those principles over time. More importantly, I've always said this, the ability and the will to be able to say, no, I can't. That to me underpins everything. I know as electricians, there's a lot of bravado, just get it done, work on a new panel, work on a new system. But the ability to say no is such a strength nowadays, I think, especially in modern society where mental health is very prevalent and we all quite open to speak about it. The last thing you want to do is go to work and just be under immense strain, whether you've done something safely. Because the last thing you want to do is go into work, wire up something you've never wired up before, and then go home, hope everything's okay. The next day there's been a fire or someone's got hurt from working on it, and you're just going to be like, oh no, what have I done? That's not a way to learn. That's not a way to develop your competence at
Was
all.
it me?
Yeah, what was it me? Could I have done anything better? That's a horrible thing that we wouldn't want anyone to go through, really, to be honest with you. But yes, a skate. Richard, it's the first time I ever heard it when I met you, and I absolutely love it, and it's gonna stay with me for the rest of my career.
I
Um,
don't know where I got it from. It isn't mine.
oh, isn't it?
I have
Oh,
blagged
you
it off somebody else, but
thieving bastard.
I have no idea. And if you were that person, I do apologise. You'll have to DM me and I'll give you the credit.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I wouldn't worry too much. It's good ideas should always be shared, and let's be perfectly frank. In our industry, if you come up with a good idea, someone's going to nick it anyway. To be
and
perfectly frank.
all these bits, as you've said, are fluid. They all meld and melt into one another.
So when I do my talks on competence and I credit you for that skate term, I shall uncredit you immediately. I know
The
the bloke who
unknown,
nicked it off someone else.
yeah, definitely plagiarism.
Okay, so just in general, where do you think if I asked you a number of questions about competence? So if I said to you, uh, where do you, if you could score the competence of the industry, that's the first part, and secondly, the electricians in our industry, where would you put it? Because there's a lot of good ones on social media who are really, really, trying to reverse turn the damage by helping and supporting and educating. But there's also, still a lot who don't know that they may not be
Don't
very
know.
competent. But where do you think the industry is sitting at the moment in regards to competence?
I would like to say we're better than we are, but I don't think we would make a 5 out of 10.
Mm,
We have elements. There's a document, you've probably seen it, the IET, is it the BCA publication, giving building control authorities a risk assessment model to risk assess the skills and experience and competence of the guys that they're having in to do electrical work as third parties.
Do you know what? I think Ryan has spoken about it to me, but I don't think I've ever actually seen that document. Forgive me, because I've never really done that much local authority other than been on the tools working in risers and stuff when I was agency. So,
Yeah, this is to give the local authorities, building control specifically, a guidance model for people that aren't registered with the CPS. And it
mm,
takes the known qualifications at the time, and I think this is a 2004 2005 document.
okay.
There'll be some courses that have snuck up that are no longer in there, and it will take things like Eng-Tech and give that a grade against somebody who's done a short course, and they'll scale them 1 to 5 and risk assess
Now
for
I'm
the
worried.
local authorities.
Now I'm worried because Eng-Tech, you couldn't compare Eng-Tech to a 2391 at all.
Yes,
NCAC is
it's
a.
an IET document, mate. So of course.
Oh, you're
Um,
joking. Oh God.
but anyway, there are things I don't like about it.
Yeah.
There are
Well, I'm sounding like I don't like it either.
there are things that I can't. We see it a lot. We see competence bandied about a lot. We
Yeah.
see card providers saying it's competence. We see professional organisations saying they're assessing competence, but this is an active, alive piece of work that needs to be assessed all the time. And part of your model is how you're going to monitor and review the competency on a regular basis.
I think that's one of the key things, isn't it? Is consistently reviewing. I mean, I've said I'm not a competent electrician anymore. I'm hoping I'm a competent client now. But when I was an electrician, I will openly admit that when I first started as an electrician, even though I did an apprenticeship, I was lacking huge skills. I had a skills gap. You know, I
Mm.
did a commercial industrial apprenticeship mainly. And then when I was doubling up, I went back into domestic, and it was almost like doing another apprenticeship. And
Mm.
during that time, I did some very poor work. And I only know I did some poor work because I remember looking back, and I will openly and freely admit there was a good 1 or 2 years of my life where I was not competent doing domestic work. I mean, I wasn't dangerous, but I was not competent in what I was doing. Um, you know, I don't think I was better than most or worse than most, but this is why. I mean, we have an Instagram page, and it's full of, other than our little adventures, it's full of pictures of very poor installations, and we try and use it as codable. Please go. If you want a picture of a bad job, here's how not to do it. Because in my career, I've learned a lot from the mistakes I've made, and the mistakes of others around me, and the mistakes of major projects. Because I think part of competence is learning the lessons for you as an individual. I think it builds character, and this is why I think it's so hard. You look at the HSE combination of training, skills, experience. Well, that experience word straight away, that's I learned from my area. I mean, I set fire to the roof of King's Cross Station. Oh yeah, I probably shouldn't have admitted that, but hey, I set fire to the roof of King's Cross Station on a condenser that I didn't put the cables away properly. I was an apprentice, got away with it, but oh boy, did I! Well, hey, it wasn't a major fire, by the way, but it did shut the station for a few hours, and I did get a hell of a kicking for it. And boy, that experience never left me. I had to develop my skills. I had to learn everything about torquing and bolts and sizes and screws and terminations and lugs and crimping and all the rest of it. I didn't have any training for it, but I did develop that. And when you look at, I've researched quite a lot competency, and there is it's the Fire Risk Assessors Council. Their definition of competence doesn't even require qualification. It just
No.
requires suitable experience.
Mm.
So it's very hard to define competence across industries. I think in the electrical one, if I can be quite bold, you just need to give a shit. I think one of
Mm.
the key things is care, have passion, you
Mm.
know, not just whatever, it's not my problem. So many sparks I've met in our industry, they've, especially the agency ones, and again, not a kick on agency because I used to do it, they just think, well, when I've left that job, if I get pumped, there's no comeback on me. Yes, there is.
I'm gone. Yeah.
Yeah, there is comeback on them. If they've signed in on a job sheet somewhere, you know, if plot 22 needed to be wired up, and then 9 months later, Mrs. Jones moves into plot 22, and Joe Blogg's Spark has got his name down as done first and second fix, and it got missed by the tester because it didn't get tested. Because then, yes, there's liability on the builder and the employer, but that Spark's going to get dragged over the coals as well,
Mm.
even if he was agency. I think a lot of people don't realise that, to be honest with you. What's your
Yeah.
view on it?
Um, I don't like the way that we look at our individual competency as a trade at the moment. Very few people would find it easy to provide evidence of their competency for the HSE if they came calling. Working as an authorizing engineer has taught me a little bit more about evidence.
Well,
And
tell us about your role as an authorising engineer, because a lot of sparks may be just, you know, one man band house basher with an apprentice. What is an authorising engineer?
so an authorizing engineer is an independent professional advisor. They look at they generally work within complex systems. So you'll be big industrial companies, healthcare, the MOD use them a lot, and they are a professional advisor that can be brought in as an independent source of knowledge. They're also a key audit tool and an assessment tool. So part of my role is to go in to look at a company, assess how many competent people they need to operate that within an electrical environment, the training that those guys need, the type of systems they're working on, and I will make nominations to the duty holder as to what level of competence and what training, and whether or not they're ready to be appointed or not. So these guys predominantly are going to be issuing permits to people to make sure the systems are safe. So they need an understanding, they need a knowledge, they need to be able to prove to me formally that they know their systems, and that will need to be documented. And then annually, I will go in and during the year, they can call me up for anything they want, but woe betide them if I turn up on site and they've mucked up during the year. I will audit the paperwork they've issued. I will audit how they've assessed the competent persons below them's competency to work within their sites. So predominantly, this will be contractors coming in. So getting them to understand what makes an electrician, an electrical worker, competent to work within their environment.
So there's a couple of bits here for people listening. So when Richard says knowing your systems, just for the avoidance of doubt here, because there's a lot, I'm imagining if I was a self-employed lad, some of the questions that I would have, Richard, so bear with me here. So systems, their systems could be the physical electrical systems that you have to work on or near to, but also the systems can also mean the safety management systems, the safe systems of work, the control measures when taking an equipment out of service, but more importantly also into service in a safe manner. Now, just to put in one question I've got for you quickly before I give an example of where I've had to do similar. On a new build domestic home, so let's say I go to Barratt Homes and I've been given 20 plots that I've got to wire up. Now I've got to wire them up, I've got to power them up. Would we need an authorizing engineer for that?
No.
Okay,
the network feeding into that, the DNO's network may well do, and they will have senior authorized persons, SAPs, doing the isolations. If you've got a new housing estate, you might have a new transformers being plopped in there, an 800 kVA or 1000 kVA transformers being dropped on that plot, and a senior authorized person will be managing that switch on initially.
Yeah, and I mean I have worked on new build sites, and what we found was the DNO would actually do new connections, which I've actually done new connections, and luckily when I was trained quite well, and I was a qualified spark. And when I used to go there, I used to make sure that there was a certificate with the dead test results, that the installation was earthed and it was fit to be energized. Otherwise, I wouldn't energize it. But on a lot of new builds now, I know I've got a lot of friends who work on new builds. What they now say is they wire up and they just go to the site manager. And the site manager will go and flick the power on, assuming they know what they do, and then basically sign a bit of paper for his job sheet to say, yeah, this installation was energized, onto the testers, and they get signed, especially if they're on price work. So just to be clear, the systems, whether they be physical systems or procedural systems, you as an individual must take reasonable precautions to ensure that you're protecting yourself and persons around you. If you don't, then you're opening yourself up and you're very liable under these very free documentations that are available. Because one thing you need to remember from listening to this podcast is every single thing in this world that can land you in prison or in the dock is free. That way there is absolutely no excuse for you to be able to say I didn't know or I couldn't comply. And sadly, as electricians, the stuff that apparently allows us to comply is what we spend thousands of pounds on, i.e. regs, books, guidance, notes and everything else. So it's worth reminding, if you're going to learn the regs, I would recommend you learn the electricity at work regulations, because they're free, they're cheaper, and there are less things to remember. And those things will save your life, protect people and keep you out of jail a lot easier than the wiring regs will. I think that's fair to say. Would you say, Richard?
I think so. You're not going to be stood up in court for breach of the wiring regulations.
No, you're not. Which is why exactly they're a guidance note, or code of practice at best. Now, I'll give you an example of something I did, Richard, which I think was similar. So I worked for EDF Energy on the underground, and EDF Energy had a Safe Systems of Work standard, which I still remember the number, E4056, which I believe is now 1-114 or 118. But anyway, and as part of that, I had guidance notes, and within that, there was a licensing scheme for safe isolations. And basically, you would go onto a course in Acton, and you would be given a set of questions. And in the first 5 minutes, you needed 100%, or you failed, and you were thrown off the course. Now, of 10 blokes going on the course, 9 would fail. So the tutor would be doing direct teaching of a safe isolations course. Now, at the time, EDF Energy were the largest employers in the underground. They had over 2,000 electricians, 110 stations to rewire, and in the standard there was a role called the engineering manager, and the engineering manager, very similar to your job, was basically the authorizing engineer. So there was someone who was qualified and competent who could demonstrate. I was also the NICQS, and I then had to sign off these blokes going on the course, which the minute they gave me that responsibility, as you can imagine, a lot of things changed. Because the first thing I said was, well, if you've given me that role in writing, Mr. Managing Director, I want every electrician who's going out that course sat in front of me. I want their qualifications before they sit in front of me. I want to meet them. I want to talk to them. I want to test their knowledge. And then I will make recommendations whether they are competent enough to go on a course and what grade of license they'll be applying for, because on every single spark who worked for EDF, on the back of their card was my signature and a tick, and then London Underground endorsed that. And what was happening was a lot of agency guys were going on the course, leaving EDF and still believing they were authorized, which weirdly enough, I actually, about 2 years after I left EDF, I took a guy's license off of him because he didn't remember it was my name on the back of his license. So people need to be very wary if you are going to be working on your electrical systems, that you need to be authorized, even in someone's home. You and I, Richard, we've both done house bashing in our time. I remember once I worked on someone's house, and I was told by my boss, you're going to go in and you're going to change the electricity meter. I was doing some agency work for Siemens metering. And at the time, I rang him up and I said, there's no one in. And he said, just pull the main fuse, which is just dumb, and change the meter. Luckily, before I did that, a woman answered the door and she said, my mum is on dialysis upstairs. And if I'd have pulled that, I could have done her serious damage. And somebody did a few years later, and it stopped all that, just going in and pulling the fuse and powering everyone's homes down. But you really do need to make sure you are authorised to be touching and working on near people's equipment, regardless of where you work. I think it's fair to say.
Seek permission to disconnect supply.
Mm-hmm.
To blow that up into a hospital, you want to make sure that the clinical teams are aware, that everybody's on board with what you're doing, especially if it's major planned maintenance. There's a big piece of work, the resilience around these places. Could be an airport, could be air traffic control. There's a big bit of planning work that goes into these bigger places that we don't see. So just one for you. Do you feel that it's fair that domestic installations get classed as a lesser installation? I've seen a comment recently. Well, they don't need to be so competent because it's a simple system.
No, I think inherently in a domestic installation, there are more simplistic controls required, because in a domestic installation, once you've assessed it, there are normally one D&O intake in a domestic installation, one consumer unit. Henceforth, you might have more control to isolate, whereas you and I both know if I take you onto a London Underground station that has 8 D&O intakes and static switches and changeovers, isolating just a socket, you may have to apply isolations at a number of points. Within a domestic installation, I would say it is more simplistic to apply control measures. I wouldn't say it's inherently more an easier installation, because I've done domestic, I've done commercial, industrial. They are hard graft regardless, and I would say domestic is harder because you're under more time pressures.
You've been to work. I remember that amount.
You what? Sorry.
Oh, you've been to work.
Oh God, yeah. So no, I do not put one above the other. I think they both have their challenges.
Especially as you're bringing in stuff like EV now. There's lots of nasty little things that are sneaking in
Well,
that you need to be competent and aware of and do the training. It doesn't matter whether it's domestic to me or not. I think that's hard work.
I tell you what, Richard, I think you're right
Nasty
because,
little bits, not lots of nasty little bits in there. And the guys that can bang out these rewires, what's the Scottish guy, Jamie? I
don't
haven't
know.
seen him on social media for a little while, but the rate that his teams get through the rewires is just commendable. If they're to the standard that he says they are, then they're brilliant.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah. Yeah, I don't believe that for a second. I have worked with people who've said I can do 3 or 4 kitchens in a day. Horse shit. You're either Superman, or the Flash, or something is not being done somehow in some way. And this is why I blame the advent of RCDs. Just if in doubt, RCD it out.
Chuck it in.
I think RCDs have been a huge. Tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think RCDs, the more that they're mandated, the more they're mitigating for incompetence. And I think now we've snookered ourselves, Richard, because in the latest wiring regs, we've now got all these different types of RCDs, and people are struggling to understand these types of RCDs because the technology is getting smarter and smarter. The protective conductor currents and the leakage is getting more complex. We're now looking at effectively mutual interaction of or EMI, electromagnetic interference, which is not in a Sparks vocabulary, and Sparks are now having to be able to identify that. It doesn't help that you then go to a live event for an industry body and they go, don't worry about it. You can put your TV on an AC type RCD, and yet yesterday on social media there is a boiler manufacturer now saying put your boilers on a B RCD. Now that's 500 quid for one device. That's a set of Henley blocks. That's a separate board, and that is ridiculous. And this is where the free market's done it, because in Europe, Type B is far more common, and these Type B breakers are recommended because somebody's done their measurements. Somebody's looked at this inverter technology and gone, "Oh, actually, all this combination of this technology in this kit, it's leaking. We need Type B." So someone's measuring more than 6 milliamps of DC out of this equipment. And then when you speak to them, I mean, yesterday they tweeted me and said, "Oh, don't worry, it's German standard. It's only guidance." Fuck, really? Really? So when all of Europe are banning AC type RCD slowly but surely, we don't have to follow the Germans. When the Germans are all they're doing is following the IEC 60364 suite of standards, which we follow anyway. So if a manufacturer says, please don't, you don't have to follow it, isn't there a regulation in 7671 that says follow a manufacturer's instructions?
Yeah, somewhere in there, Paul.
There is
you'll dig that up.
There is a regulation. So when someone on social media tells you something from a manufacturer, please take it as a pinch of salt. I've just challenged them, and I'm looking forward to having that debate. But also for the plumbers and gas fitters out there, that's going to cause chaos for them. And they go through enough chaos in their industry the way the gas safe works. So they don't need that. I've got some quick questions for you, Richard. Would you like to do some quick fire questions on competence? Okay, so I'm going to ask you a number of questions as to how you would determine competence. So I'm coming, let's say you've got 10 people coming to see you today for a job and you need to get through all 10. How would you do it? Would you give your employees a test?
I have, and I do. They can have both a written paper and a scenario.
Okay. Would you ask them possibly to then maybe do a self-assessment?
I've not done a self-assessment. I've asked them to go round and assess their colleagues with me, and part of my assessment of them is to walk them through their site and talk to them about the kit that they've got, be it UPS or generators or.
And that's a key thing. So would you maybe put them in a role play or a role play based on a real situation or scenario? Because that's what I kind of do when I interview people. What?
Certainly, we have, or I use 2 interviews. So you have an initial interview that basically discusses with them the role that they're applying for. Then we go through a training assessment to review what training they've got and what education, to see whether there's any holes in that. Then I will more than likely drag them around site and say, right, you've got to isolate this panel. Tell me what considerations you've got before you touch it. And then we'll run through the risk assessments, letting people know, checking the kit that's hung on the end of it, points of isolation, points of backfeed. And then we would expect them to go off and do the safe system of work training. So this is over an extended period of time. And then I will come back and I will set them a 30-question exam paper, and I will set them a scenario for something they're likely to come across with kit they've got on site for planned maintenance. So it might be thermal imaging on a buzz bar system where they've got to work on or near live conductors, and get them to tell me how they're going to make that safe and how they're going to operate that safe.
I think that's key as well. So obviously a lot of what you're describing is quite critical. It's commercial, industrial stuff where when you are doing switching, you're working in hospitals, you're working around equipment that is critical to life support to keep people who are ill or infirmed. Hospitals need power constantly. They can't. A lot of installations need consistent power for data storage, for human life. And again, in the regs, it's about protection of persons first. And a lot of systems are configured so that if you do need to switch them off, you need to do a heavy amount of planning. Now, a lot of the guys who are doing domestic go, "Cool, bloody hell, I wouldn't want to work for him." But the principles, yes, okay, you may not need to do the infinite amount of documentation and safe system of work planning and everything, but you are doing it in a house in your head. You are walking into an installation. You're checking that the earthing is present. If not, you've got an immediate non-compliance. You're looking at the condition of the board. You're looking at physical appearance, access to live parts, wear and tear. You're visually inspecting every second you're in there because you're planning, how do I work on this safely? Now, within most domestic installations, the first thing that Sparks will do is they'll remove the board cover live. Now, best practice would immediately say, well, what you're going to do is actually isolate it, ask permission of the homeowner. You will then isolate each breaker, throw the main switch, and then remove the main cover. That's what you would do. But a lot of Sparks don't do that, probably because of confidence, bravado, complacency, maybe. Again, it depends on the age, condition of the board, whether you're capable and confident enough to do that. For me, I have learned the hard way. I basically, when I walk in, if I know I'm working on that board, I'll say, I'm going to need to knock your power off temporarily, if anything. I'll knock all the breakers off. The main switch will go off. I'll take the board cover off, and then I'll do some inspection. And if I'm not planning to work on that board for a while, I'll give the person their power back because I have control. Nobody's coming into that board. I'm under the stairs and I'm doing my visual inspection. I'm looking for wear to tear. I'm not going to be sticking my fingers in the board. I'm just assessing and gathering my thoughts for how I need to approach the work. And then when I'm ready, off it back goes, board cover goes on, go to my van, get prepared to do my work. And then I'll get an isolation kit. I'll lock off at the main switch, or I'll pull the DNO fuse. I openly admit I've pulled DNO fuses, but I will say in my defense, I was trained by the DNO to pull fuses, to check for reverse polarity at the main heads and all that. I was actually trained by Siemens to do it. I had pliers, I went round and do it, so I was very confident to do that. For me, if anybody says that I do that still, I always say to them, ring up the power boards, get a main switch put in. That's the right way of doing it. So even I can admit that I have suffered from electrician bravado before. My house downstairs, I have a double pole isolator, which I had the DNO install for me, because I don't want to go back to my old way of doing things. I want to go forward and do things the right way. And I always say to Sparks when they ask me about boards, how to work in domestic houses safely, I always say to someone, if you're pricing for a new consumer unit, price for a double pole isolator. Why wouldn't you?
£7, £8.
It's a no-brainer. Get a double pole isolator in MEM1, Wilex1. It's great. It gives you far more control over the installation, far more control over that. And the best thing is, you can work on that board and there's no source of energy. However, saying that, this is where the competence needs to go up a bit, I think, Richard.
Mm.
Look at what we did in a recent podcast. We were talking to Adrian Davey and Dave Watts about competence and skills, and what they're learning in colleges doesn't reflect with City and Guild syllabuses, but also the technology. Uh, you now need to look into a house rather than just looking at the earthing. You now need to look at battery storage, alternative sources of energy. Well, I never had that when I was on the tools,
That
but
PV.
now, yeah, PV, EV, miniature UPSs. People, I know one bloke underneath his stairs, no word of a lie, he's got a UPS
Mm.
under his stairs for his house,
Yeah.
and it actually runs his lights. So when he's had blackouts, he's still got all his lights on.
Mm.
Probably nicked off a job, in all fairness, actually, but probably was. But
Ideal instant emergency lighting, and as long as you keep that system maintained.
yeah, but let's
I've
be honest
seen
about it.
too many of them that have gone up in flames, the little ones, because
Well,
nobody ever bothers looking at them.
well, yeah, tell me about it. And I know houses now, brand new builds, because I looked at them 2 years ago, that have got sprinkler systems in them and emergency lighting in
Mm.
domestic properties. So I think the technology that's going into the domestic home is getting more complex, and I think there is a mass upskilling needed for people to consider the connected loads more while they're working on or near. What's your view on
Yeah,
that?
definitely. Things have changed a lot since I did my apprenticeship. I was lucky enough to get on a JOB one. Coming onto this, I had a little look back at my course stuff because I'm a bit weird like that, and
Okay.
I did 28 weeks taught as a junior,
Oh
and
wow.
I had to add another 12 weeks practical on site to get that first year signed off and to do my AM1. I don't even think
Well,
they
that's
do
proper old
AM1
school.
anymore.
No,
Um,
AM1 got ditched when I started my apprenticeship. So,
Long time ago. And
mm,
then second year, I did 39 days taught, and I had 189 days practical to get the second year signed off. And then I became an improver, and then I had another 228 days for 3 years until I could sit my AM2 and get my MVQ level 3. And I was actually amazed. I found my old AM2 completion certificate, and I didn't realise I'd done audio and visual signalling systems, safe isolation, testing and inspecting, but it was all there. Um, I started mine in 1983. That was a few years ago now, but
yeah, I was in primary school, dude.
bless.
I was in primary school, reading about weird monsters and stuff like that. Um, I think this. We see a lot of YouTubers now. We did myself, Dave Watts, and John Ward. We did and Dan Jackson. We did a video at Elects in Coventry, trying to tell people that if you do stuff publicly, you have a responsibility to be. Well, I'm always honest and try to be honest and transparent. I've grown and learnt from my mistakes, which is I think a positive. But a lot of YouTubers online, some of them, there's one or two, God help them, awful, awful, awful content. They're almost glad to be performing work dangerously, and this is one thing I keep saying to people is whatever you do on social media, you've got a duty of care, because there is no, me and you know this, in law, there's such things when an incident happens in society where there's never happened before, you then set something called a precedent,
Yeah,
and law has to decide how to react to that precedent. Now, at some point, I genuinely do believe that a someone is going to get very badly hurt, not hopefully not killed, but someone's getting very badly hurt. And I know from speaking to individuals in E5, one of the individuals in E5 had a 12-year-old message them and ask for recommendations because they were changing their fuse board at home. Okay, this is
bless.
genuinely true, and he's probably listening to this going, "Oh, fuck, Paul, don't say
Don't
that."
tell them that.
But it is true. A 12-year-old messaged them and said, "I want to change. What's the best board?" Now that 12-year-old, there's enough on YouTube for them to be able to figure it out and do it. But if that 12-year-old gets hurt and their parents go, "Oh well, he was obsessed with watching this YouTuber and that YouTuber," and it's life-changing injuries like major crippling or burns, then those parents may wish to take a civil, which is a private prosecution, out against that YouTuber. That will then create a precedent which YouTube's lawyers will want to get involved with, and may have them rewrite their policies and procedures and then query what that content goes on. It's not, again, restriction of democracy, because some people say, oh, well, I'll just put don't try this at home. Bullshit. If you're showing people how to do stuff and you're not following all due diligence, then you are liable. You have guilty knowledge. You have contributed towards the harm or injury of another. And this is why we did our thing, because it scared the hell out of us, a 12-year-old emailing us saying, I'm changing my board. And this is why we said, look, we will love and respect the YouTube and all that community. But if you're going to do stuff deliberately just to get a kick or a laugh, then you're like the Jeremy Kyle of YouTuber, and you can, we're just going to tell you, no, stop. I mean, if I look, I'll pick one of the things that I like about the HSG 85 document, which is called Electricity at Work, Safe Working Practices. On page 9, there's actions for managers and supervisors, and it's really, really good, because when you're working alone, you are your own supervisor to a certain extent. You supervise, you're responsible for your own actions. And there's great notes in here that says, people should establish safe systems of rules and procedures whenever work is to be carried out, or ensure contractors brought in to do work have appropriate rules and procedures. They should be written down, and everybody should be made aware of them. Now, I know under 5 you don't necessarily have employees, you don't have to have health and safety policies, but I love it when I see electrical contractors standing around the circle and the guy's briefing them about the job. Even if he's criticising the drawings, he's going, right, lads, this is what I'm doing basket, you're doing tray, you're doing this. I'll do the board connections only when all first fix are done. I'll go around and check. And it's really good to set some rules. I mean, I've seen guys, you were probably raised with this, but safe isolation on a big panel. One guy would be at the panel, another guy would be by the side, and they would work to a procedure. And the guy doing the work would say, I'm removing my rings. Yep, you're removing your rings. I'm removing my watch. My hands have no conductive metalwork on whatsoever. I'm now checking my gloves, insulated gloves. If he's working live, which can be done because he's taking a voltage measurement or an impedance measurement. So he's removed a cover, and before he's done that, he's followed a documented procedure. But what I love is when guys shout it out to each other, because they're keeping their wits about them. They're following a defined set of steps and making sure that it's right for the task being done. And I've sat and watched guys, and I wish to God I could have filmed it, because it was just poetry, listening to some sparks doing isolations. And even when I'm doing domestic, I'll sit there and I'll go, right, switch off all the breakers, don't want a surge in load, switch off the main switch, I'll remove the cover. Do I have GS38 probes? Do I have gloves? I have got insulated gloves, by the way. Do I have brown trousers? They're optional. And I go through it in my head, and sometimes I mumble it to myself. Some of the people on YouTube are doing some very irresponsible and dangerous stuff, I think it's fair to say. And I don't think they know any better, which is quite scary, which is, again, a sad indictment of the education in our industry. I mean, if you say to a Spark, what's the regulation in the electricity at work regs for competency?
16.
Oh, I know. Yeah, of course you fucking know it. Yeah. So it's for everyone listening, Richard has just given you the keys to your freedom. It's regulation 16, persons to be competent to prevent danger and injury. And years ago, for those who are a little bit older and greyer, they'll remember that the wiring regulations used to say that good workmen, there was a regulation, it used to be, here's a sad bit, 1330101, when it was dashed. So this is 16th edition. It used to say, good workmanship and materials by competent persons. That then got removed at the era of 17th edition. And now the only reference to competence in the wiring regulations is the competence of the tester, not the installer, because they use the term skilled and instructed, which is quite scary.
Good workmanship appears.
Yeah. But what's your view on this whole... Everything's about levels and layers now, because we spoke in a podcast the other day about the term electrician being dead. Dave Watts is of the firm belief that the title of electrician is dead, and now we're going to have lots of subcomponents, installer, first fixer, second fixer, commercial electrician, industrial electrician, or electrical fitter, because the sheer volumes of information that we're required to hold are not being taught at the college level. What's your view on it?
I think JIB handbooks had multiple layers of multiple different discipline descriptions for eons. I don't think we can get away from the fact that it's been subdivided. Commercial, industrial stuff's been quite often broken down into containment, first fix, second fix, somebody else coming in testing later. The breaking down and the separating of it, unfortunately, has melted the electrician away a little bit. Going back in the day when I started, the electrician did everything from start to finish. The same guys that were on site doing the installation work were doing the verification as they built it up, and they did the testing when they finished it. That quite often is left to somebody else coming in and supposedly verifying it, maybe if he's managed to get out of his van.
So,
and then,
if you're younger and you're listening to this, and you've only been in the trade a number of years, it's worth informing you that a lot of the old school guys. So when I was taught as an apprentice, I was told, if you are a spark, an electrician, you should be able to design it, select and erect it, finish the install, test the damn thing, fill in a bit of paper, and hand it over. And if you can do that, you're a spark. And regardless whether it's trunking, conduit tray, ladder rack, plastic conduit, or twin and sin, twin and earth, and armoreds and pyro, you should be able to do that. And that was about as simple as the industry ever was. But it's got more complex, and those roles have never embraced that upskilling or the CPD. I work with electricians who over 20 years have never done any courses. When the wiring regs come out, you go, oh, there's a new regs book, and they'll go, oh, really? Is it Amendment 2 of the 16th? No, it's just the 18th edition has just come out. Oh, blimey. Shows how out of date I am. But they'll always say, fundamental principles ain't changed, though, have they? You're like, well, no, not really. Conduit's always conduit, trunking's always trunking. But it's the application of that technology and the understanding of how to apply that technology. I mean, how many sparks are still installing AC type RCDs and are still being advised, yeah, there's nothing wrong with them, it's fine, general. What's general? Well, generally, I don't want to get stabbed in the streets, but I don't always get what I bloody well want, do I? And I was stabbed when I was frigging 15. So you don't always get what you want in life, and I hate that term general. I think it should be removed from the regs, and I think ACRCD should be banned, but there you go, rant over about that.
You've got that problem of what the guys are being are able to pick up in the wholesalers as well.
The wholesalers are a fucking curse.
Should we be able to walk into a mainstream DIY supplier?
So if you work for TLC and you're listening to this, please stop selling stuff to the general public. Amount of times I've been in the TLC and somebody walks in and says, I want to run a supply to my shed, and the bloke whips out a drum of SY Flex and stuffing glands and says, there you go, stick that. That's like a Flex, but it's tougher, it's armored. And I'm literally behind them going, whoa, what are you doing? Why you? First of all, you need an armored cable and you need to seek the services of an electrician. Oh, what earthing system you got? Pardon? Oh, I don't know. Geeks behind the counter. Have you asked them? No. So straight away, these wholesalers, TLC, I'll repeat that, TLC direct, are absolutely doing our industry no service whatsoever. All they care about is sales. And that's why I will happily drop a wholesaler if I find they're acting in an unethical way. And I do think some of them are very, very poor, to be honest with you. And they don't help. They don't help the problem. Because Sparks would have to go around and go, no, Mrs. Jones, sorry, that's actually the wrong cable. It's not made to British standard. It's not actually an armoured as such. It's a braid. It's a screening for electromagnetic interference. And yeah,
and for the Sparkies that are trying to install stuff right.
Yep.
And they pitch up with a £500 distribution board, fully laden with the RCBOs that they should have. And Mrs. Jones says, well, but I can get that for 90 quid down my local shop. The bloke in there says it's fine. We are we are not helped along our way.
Mate, one of my colleagues yesterday said to me, I've just bought a new house. The electric cable comes from overhead poles. And I thought, okay, TT installation. And we're getting a new fuse box. And the bloke in the wholesaler has sold us a Hager one with these little individual special. And I basically got up the Hager manual. I went, type A RCBOs. And they went, yeah. I said, you got surge protection? They went, no, what's that? Have you got a main switch? No, what's that? Who's doing it? Oh, my husband's doing it. I said, do you have an earth? And they went, what do you mean? I said, have you got an earth electrode? Oh, I don't know. Why would I need that? I mean, how many wires you got going into existing fuse board? Oh, it's a red and a black. Is there a green and yellow? No. So you haven't even got an electrode? No. Have you just bought the house? Yeah. Did you get a certificate with it? No. So I literally said, can you take a picture of it and send it to me? Yeah. It's a TT supply, no earth. No earth. Just hasn't existed. Out in the middle of nowhere, on a farm, just didn't bother. Fortuitous earthing, I would call that. Just indirect paths, more probably. You'll probably get a few hundred ohms on the sockets, maybe, but
the odd passing cow.
Yeah, well, it'll earth via the back boxes, won't it? Via a tie-in eye or some other indirect means, which is a bit of a shame. But yeah, so there's a lot of work.
There's nothing in place to stop this from happening.
The industry isn't regulated. We have no industry bodies that regulate us. This is why, Richard, you especially, and myself, we are constantly crusading for people to learn the electricity at work regulations. And for those listening, you need to learn regulation 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, 16 being the competence one. I have found that most people only learn 11, 12, 13, and 14. Maybe 15. It's definitely not 16. And the reason why is very simple. If you do something which is dangerous, there is a defence regulation which is fantastic. It occurs in quite a lot of laws of the land. And basically, the regulation 29 of the Electricity at Work Reg says, in any proceeding for an offence consisting of a contravention of the regs I've just said, it shall, so it's a shall one, be a defence for any person to prove you took all reasonable steps and exercised all due diligence to avoid the commission of that offence. And Regulation 29, which is called Defence, will apply in criminal proceedings. It provides you a defence if you can establish you took reasonable steps and exercised all due diligence. So if you go into that house and you've seen there's no bonding and you still make the alteration and addition, that 1326 regulation, you're in breach of that. You could then be in breach of Regulation 8, which is earthing of the Electricity at Work regulation. And if somebody gets a shock off the pipework, you have to prove that you told them that there was no bonding on the earthing. Otherwise, you haven't taken all reasonable steps and done your due diligence, which means you are going to get fined, potential going to prison. And I know the HSE are super keen for fines at the moment, and nobody ever wants to go to prison, because if someone goes to prison, somebody's dead. Generally, isn't it?
Yeah, and it brings us back down to 7671, the HSE statement on page 13. Installations which conform to the standard laid down in BS 7671 are regarded by the HSE as likely to achieve conformity. So another form of your defence is ensuring as best as possible that you work within this. And it repeats it again in 114.1. While the regulations are non-statutory, they may be used in court to come as evidence to claim compliance with statutory requirements. Now, I have heard from people that have said, well, we got in trouble and we weren't allowed by the judge to use 7671, but they'd fallen foul of one of the other myriad of regulations, pure safe system, pure working at height, PPE regs, a number of other ones. So there's a raft of them that you need to be careful of when you're working.
So what's pure, Richard? For the listeners, pure. What could you just describe some of these other pieces of legislation? Because again, if you ever go to court, it will always be the Health and Safety at Work Act, which is called it's the highest piece of legislation when you're at work in the land. But under that, they have regulations, electricity at work regs. Do you want to just explain the other ones which are prevalent to electricians?
Yeah, you've got the Management of Health and Safety at Work regs. which is basically your risk assessments. So you gauge your risk and you ensure that you've got proper control measures in place. Working at height is obvious, although less obvious is you don't have to be at height to be pinned for it. Pure provision. What is it, Paul? Provision and use.
Workplace equipment regulations.
That's the one. So any equipment, Paul's talked about USB sockets before now, little charger points. It might be your 2-pole tester that you use for proving dead. Does it?
Indeed, yes. Well, your probes and proving units. So if your boss says, I'm not having the equipment calibrated, I'm not having this stuff tested and checked, well, under the provision and use of workplace equipment regulations, your employer has to, under the Health and Safety at Work Act, provide a safe place of work, safe systems and processes, and that includes equipment. And I'll never forget my first safety course. The bloke who did it was a scaffolder, and he just sat there and he reeled out all this legislation, and he said it was all bollocks. And I was like, why is it all bollocks? And he said, because the Health and Safety at Work Act is the highest law of the land when you're at work. It's been there since 1974, but no bugger follows it. And because of that, they keep having to create more legislation underneath it, which is specific to sectors to ensure that they're meeting that highest piece of legislation. Now, Richard, I'm gonna throw you a curveball. So there is a British standard which I would recommend people read. God, there's probably a queue of them. BS0, which is the standard for standards, which is a free download, and it's section 9.2. And it says in section 9.2, so I want you to read this afterwards. I have a highlighted copy. Standards, British standards, are always subordinate to the law. It is important they are drafted to avoid any confusion between the provision of a standard and a requirement imposed by law. In general, okay, so I don't think the wire and regs do confuse the issue. They sit under the law. They're the detail behind it. But then it says, in general, it is not acceptable for standards to contain provisions that are already requirements imposed by law, nor contain any statement recommending or requiring compliance with law. So that little statement at the start from the HSE that says it is generally accepted, I don't believe it should even be in there.
No.
And yet it's been in there for donkeys. And I asked the HSE why it's in there. They can't give you an answer because all they do is manually update it. And that statement has been in there long before BS0. So I genuinely believe on the next edition of Wine Regs, I'm going to put a comment in that says this should not be, and I've written to the BSI about it, it should not be in the wine regulations, because what they're doing is they're using the electricity at work regulations to almost mandate you must use this to comply with the law. No, you just need to use common sense and good engineering practice. You know, don't kill people. I mean, you could take the first 6 pages of chapter 13 and say, there, comply with that. And you'd be complying with the rest of it's the detail. So section 9.2 BS0, well worth looking at. Always try and read and learn more than what they're feeding you from the machine. But yeah, I thought that was just a little nugget there, really, so that we can kind of wind this up on. So just before we do, what do you think individuals can do about competence, their own competence and industry competence? Have you got any advice or?
Yeah, record and evidence, CPD, familiarity, pictures, documentation, drawings, specifications. Keep evidence.
That's a good one, actually. Yeah, do you know what? You've nailed that, because I've got an app on my phone called Site Report that a friend of mine, he actually developed it, but it's called Site Report. You can get other ones where you can record and do snagging and coding. And what he does is when he goes around and does a quote, he takes pictures while he's quoting. And when he's sat there, he writes up the quote, he goes back into the pictures, assigns the codes and makes recommendations. He then appends that to the quote. And that's his dish. And at the end of it, it's got like a summary, and he says he's got a generic summary statement. He says the following should be observed. I've recommended that these are taken as additional works as per quoted. The contractor deems that he has taken reasonable and sufficient steps to inform you, and hereby discharges his duty of care under Electricity Work Regulation 29, sends that in an email, he's covered his arse. However, and I've said to many contractors, if you still go ahead and do the work, you're a bit of a twat. To be perfectly frank, I wouldn't ever work on an installation of earthing. I'm not stupid. Some contractors do. You just need to learn, I suppose, and grow from the mistakes you make, I think is my advice.
Yeah, it would also help if at some point you decide you want to get some of these daft little letters after your name. If you've got a basket of these different bits and pieces that you've collected up along the way to show that you're working to a certain level and they can assist you.
And I think that's important. I mean, I got letters after my name. It's a sign of professionalism and commitment to upholding a framework of behaviours and standards. Don't get me wrong, I can't call myself Paul Mean and BS 7671 because that's just dumb. But when you join these institutes, you are committing to their codes of conduct and promoting engineering or quality or safety. And that you will work within a code of conduct to challenge, and I think that's good. I think professionalizing it really does enhance the individual's competence. If I've said to electrical contractors, it wouldn't be a bad thing if you encourage your guys to become engineering technicians, that the management or the engineering managers become incorporated of chartered engineers, because it gives them that positive affirmation that the industry sees them as meeting a criteria, and it also helps them personally as well. And I think it's just a good thing. Doesn't have to be with the IET, can be with a number of institutes. But yeah, so I think I'm going to competency industry. I loved your comment at the start. They'd barely get a 5. I think the industry would barely get a 5. I think if I was to score the electrical industry as a whole, I would say let's score competency across the board. So electrical industry as a whole, 3 out of 10. Voluntary regulatory bodies, 4.5 out of 10. Manufacturers, 5 out of 10. Individual sparks, I know some that are 11 out of 10. I know some that are 1 out of 10. I think it'd be good to get them numbers above the 5s into the 7s and 8s, but I think that's a 10-year journey. But I am enjoying seeing the industry take some steps. I mean, look at the IET are now talking about leveling up. Voltman are now talking about upskilling. More and more people are starting to be influenced by, hopefully, some of the things we're saying. And please feel free to tell us if you think we're batshit crazy. But at the end of the day, I've always said to Sparks, the more you know, the more you learn, the more you earn.
Definitely.
The more you learn, the more you earn.
Yeah, just try and be better. Try and be better tomorrow than you were today.
Yeah, exactly. And also don't be afraid to share that knowledge. That is really key, in my opinion, which is kind of why we're trying to do this podcast. So on that bombshell,
might not have made it tonight, Paul, but still, there you go.
Richard, have you got any final thoughts for us? And before we see you again on a future podcast down the road, if you'll come back.
Yes, I have, Paul. S.K.A.T.E.
Yes.
Skills, knowledge, aptitude, training and education. Get them nailed down. Get them fixed in your head. Everybody's different. Everywhere's different. Every situation's different. And you can get to the same end point as me, Paul, anybody else on your own route. There isn't one route to get anywhere.
No, exactly. You just need to become consciously aware of where you are. And that's part of the journey. And E5 and other people will always help you. I'm always on the phone to people. I'm sure Ryan and Dave and everybody else, the Sparky Ninja community. There's lots of support networks out there that weren't there 10 years ago. And again, we're independent. We'll be honest, and we will help you develop and grow. And on that, we hope this podcast is, again, it's been a little bit of a different one. It's been more techie and legislation. Please feel free to let us know on social media what you think. Richard, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very, very much. And we will end this now. And hopefully we'll see Richard again further on down the line, talking more about competency or the industry or any subject you want him to talk about. So until the next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.